Good evening, and welcome to the second talk in this year's Dr. Bruce J. Nelson Distinguished Speaker Series. I'm Peter Saida, Professor of Physics and Physics Department Chair at Harvey Mudd College. Our Nelson Speaker Series theme this year is water. And this fall, we are exploring water with the help of speakers who are at the forefront of water science, policy, and technology. We are pleased to continue this relevant and timely conversation with tonight's panel of water experts and stakeholders, and I apologize I didn't make it rain this time. Before we introduce the panelists, I'd like to recognize that the Nelson Speaker Series is made possible through the generosity of the family of the late Bruce J. Nelson, class of 1974, who died unexpectedly in 1999. Bruce had a tremendous impact on the many people whose lives he touched as an unconventional, eclectic, and irrepressible free spirit. He graduated from Harvey Mudd as an independent program of studies major and later earned his master's in computer science from Stanford and his PhD in computer science from Carnegie Mellon. At the time of his death, he was the chief science officer at Cisco Systems. On behalf of the college and the community, I'd like to thank the Nelson family for creating such a tremendous series to honor Bruce's memory. I also would like to take this opportunity to invite you all to view a special art and video installation immediately following the lecture in the Sprague Courtyard, which is just outside the auditorium. This artwork was created especially for tonight's lecture by Steve Rowell, the artist-in-resident at the Honnold Mudd Library, and focuses on the infrastructure of water and the issue of drought in California. Lastly, I want to offer thanks to my fellow Nelson Series faculty committee members for their help in planning this year's series and bringing tonight's speakers to campus, Marianne DeLotte, Pat Little, and Tanya Srebotnik. And at this point, I'd like to invite Tanya to introduce our panelists.
Thank you, Peter. So I, too, would like to thank you all for joining us tonight to what I'm sure will be a very stimulating discussion on what is perhaps California's most precious natural resource, water. So without further wasting another precious time, I'd like to introduce our guests. We have Eric Garner, managing partner at the law practice of Best, and Krieger. Anthony Metcalf, professor of biology at California State University, San Bernardino. Jack Safely, imported supply unit manager with the Metropolitan Water District. And Heather Williams, associate professor of politics at Pomona College. And of course, our talented moderator for tonight, Brinda Sarathy, Associate Professor of Environmental Analysis and Director of the Robert Redford Conservancy for Southern California Sustainability at Pitzer College. So Brinda, thank you so much for guiding tonight's discussion, and please take it from here.
All right, so can everyone hear me? Yes. All right, welcome everyone, and as Professor Srebotnik has said, we're short on time, but to keep you engaged, I have 4 interesting things for you to think about. One amongst this panel has a Harley Davidson and uses it on date night. One amongst this panel is a Kansas City Royals fan. One is an avid bird watcher and ornithologist. And one has not a blade of grass in their landscaping, much to their delight, but to the challenge of their canine pet. So I'm not going to reveal these identities till the end, and I'd be curious as to your thoughts on who's who. So I'm going to start giving each of our esteemed panelists a very broad question. They're going to have 3 minutes, and mind you, we've got at least one academic amongst us, and I'm going to keep time. 3 minutes each to answer this very broad question. And we'll just go in order for this question. So, given your area or areas of expertise, what are the 2 biggest challenges in relation to water policy and management in the Golden State? And what are some of the key ways, you might just pick one way, to address this challenge today? So why don't we start with you? and move forward. Anthony?
Since I'm the academic.
Well, we've got two academics.
That's true. I come at this question basically from my line of inquiry as a biology professor. I got extraordinarily interested in water when I was working on population genetics of a native species of minnow that's in our drainages here on the San Gabriel watershed, San Bernardino Mountains, all the way down to San Jacinto Mountains. And I started having to think about this idea of watershed. And I realized very rapidly that the biological world, the kind of the pattern, if you will, of biodiversity in terms of streams has been pretty constant for about 10,000 years or so here. But water is such an important and rare resource coming out of our local mountains that I couldn't really find how biology and the delivery of water, if you will, could interact in any constructive way. And to tell you the truth, I still don't have an answer for that. But what that has done is made me think that there needs to be and excuse the cliche, but a holistic solution to watersheds, water conservation, and biodiversity. It's often viewed, and the other panelists are experts in this area, as an amalgam of history and law and procedure. And except for a few things like the Endangered Species Act, for example, there's a little hammer, if you will, to allow Southern California water planning to be worked in such a way that it increases biodiversity or at least maintains it in areas that still have some natural ecosystems and species diversity left. So,
All right, so holistic perspectives on biodiversity. Now on to the lawyer.
Okay, on to the lawyer, but I'm not going to start with law. I would say that data is the single biggest issue we have in managing water in California right now. You may have heard that last year California adopted a law to regulate groundwater. The first time that that's happened in California. California was the very last state to do it. Even Texas was in front of us. Texas was 49th, we were 50th. But we do not know who uses how much groundwater. So if you go to the Central Valley right now, and it's gotten a lot of publicity, it's sinking, literally, a few inches a month, because so much water is being pumped out underneath. Even if you said tomorrow, okay, everyone needs to cut back 30%, from what? And who? It's not measured. You didn't have to get a permit to start pumping, except a health permit, but nothing where anyone can monitor you, and no one knows how much you're using. Also an issue with surface water, where the state has tried to cut back surface water uses this year, and again, had a very hard time because the reporting is bad, the data is bad. So technology and data gathering is the single biggest challenge we face really in managing water resource.
Can you hear me? Oh, good. I'm going to say that the two biggest challenges facing California water are the Delta and the Delta. So it's hard to get your mind around the way that California water works, or the way that water arrives at our homes. But about 2/3 of all of the population in California is relying either wholly or partly on the Delta. And this is where, have 5 major rivers flowing into it. And we've built aqueducts conveying water from north to south, and also the Central Valley, the Central Coast. And the State Water Project conveys water destined for users both in the Bay Area and elsewhere into the Delta, where it's pumped out and then piped to people in scores of water districts. So this, for a girl from the Midwest, is this unbelievably complex and expensive waterworks that the state has. And the problem is that the Delta is is also a big natural system, and we've created problems when you convey water into it and you put up dikes for farmland and you build suburbs on it. You actually change that delta in big ways. So you have big problems of subsidence in that delta. Some areas are as much as 15 feet below sea level. So there are three liabilities. First of all, a storm surge that could come from the ocean in a big storm. Second of all, you can get a storm surge from the rivers that could overwhelm that, and with the dikes giving way, causing both major flooding and huge interruptions to the state's water supply. And then finally, an earthquake presents a huge liability because you could have liquefaction of those levees. And so we're looking at a big technical problem in the Bay Area, but as a political scientist, I will also say that coming up with a set of policies upon which people can agree for fixing that is going to occupy a lot of our energies in the coming years.
I'd just like to expand on the Delta a little bit too. Certainly, we have so many environmental challenges and the urban water use perspective. We have to have water for ourselves. We have to have water for wildlife. That's really a big challenge for us. The State Water Project has been able to be a reliable source of water for us for many decades, from the 70s and 80s. As we've moved now into the 90s and in this century, the reliability of that water has decreased significantly. Even up until 2006, we were able to get what we would say 100% of our contracted supply out of the Delta. And today, if you look at that, it's around 55 to 60% and declining. So for the urban users, it's a big challenge for us to maintain the reliability of our water supply. And at the crux of this is, how do we fix the Delta? And we have really now two what are called co-equal goals that came out of the Delta Reform Act in 2009, and that sets urban and environmental use on the same footing. And when you look at the water that moves through the Delta, about half of it goes to environmental uses and the other half for agricultural and urban uses. So we have to manage that supply for both. And we think there are ways that we can do that, where we can get more water when it's available from the Delta, protect water quality, and really looking at all the policies. The water pumpers and diverters have really taken the brunt of all the effects in the Delta. We've been cut back in what we can pump, but there are so many other factors that determine the fisheries health within that area. We've got water quality discharges, pesticides from agriculture, the salinity, sea level rise. Climate change is another thing that we need to be cognizant of, with the water coming in from the tidal surge and how that's going to affect our pumps and the water that goes to agriculture in the urban areas. I think the other piece is now being addressed with some of the groundwater management laws. I think many of you may have seen the famous picture that shows a telephone pole in the Central Valley and sinking of the valley of about 30 feet. Well, that's continuing to happen, and that's affecting our water delivery system as well at this point. So that's another big challenge for us.
All right, and I want to thank you all because you've previewed the questions we're all going to go into in more depth through the session today. So I've got focused questions now, and I've got folks that I'd want to start answering it. So this first question is for you to start with, Eric, and feel free to explain some of the terms I use for the audience as well. So California, if folks here don't know, has a very unique system of dual water rights, sometimes called the California Doctrine. These rights are composed of riparian, so if you're adjacent to a stream or river, riparian rights and appropriative rights, first in time, first in right. The holders of many senior water rights in the state are large agricultural producers who staked their water rights pre-1914. Okay, this is what's called pre-1914 rights, prior to oversight by the State Water Board. My question to you first, Eric, followed by the others, is it time for California to do away with pre-1914 rights? What are the implications of this? And perhaps you can give people in the audience a sense of context in terms of who holds that those earlier rights, and what does that mean in terms of the amount of water they have access to? And what does that mean for agricultural water users in the state? And does California have the legal authority to exercise a fundamental recalibration of rights under the doctrine of reasonable use? And you might want to explain that as well. Thank you. I teach a class on this.
And how many hours do I have to do this?
You have 5 minutes, and then the rest of the panelists will have 5 minutes, 10 minutes for this question.
Sure. All right. Let me try and explain the water law system and answer those questions at the same time if I can. California does have a dual system. And as I was chatting with someone earlier, when you get to the end of all this, you think, my God, these people were just idiots. How did they create this complex system? But in fact, it tracks history, and then it makes a lot of sense, at least as to how we got here. So here goes. When the legislature was adopting the laws of the state in 1850, they thought of a lot of things. They didn't focus on water law. So they had this catch-all provision. Anything that we didn't specifically describe, the law of England applies. Okay, that included water, which meant you got riparian rights. So the law in England is, if you live along a river, you have a right to use water on your land. And if you don't, you can't. All right, doesn't make a lot of sense here in California. Makes a lot of sense in England, perhaps. But that was the start. Okay, 1850, that's when they did that. What was going on at exactly the same time? Gold rush, right? Miners using water. Did miners own property? No. Were they using water? Heck yes. So they created their own system out there in the mines which is basically first in time, first in right. A lot of certainty. So you got the water first, you got to use it, use a fixed amount. You don't use that, someone else gets to use it. Priority system. And those are all pre-1914 rights. Those systems went along in parallel to the late 1880s when the California Supreme Court got the opportunity to pick one or the other. In most Western states, virtually every other Western state, they picked appropriative rights, got rid of riparian rights. We kept both. We are California. So we had the dual system that she just described, and those went along until we had a major conflict in the 1920s, because in the 1920s, cities and Southern California Edison were starting to build dams. The dams obviously blocked the flow of rivers and meant that downstream people who lived along those rivers, so those are riparians, were getting less water. And they said, hey, wait a minute, riparian right has a priority over appropriative right. Generally, you can't build the dam. And there's a very famous California Supreme Court case where the Supreme Court said, yeah, you're right. Edison, you can't hold water behind that dam. And it was also happening in the city of Santa Barbara. So there was a popular uprising in the state. The legislature passed a law. People of the state voted on it. It became Article 10, Section 2 of the California Constitution that said all water uses in the state have to be reasonable. And so whereas in 1926 the Supreme Court had said you can't hold water behind the dam, 7 years later they get the same case and they go exactly the other way. And that's why we have dams throughout the state that hold water. And so Article 10, Section 2 overrides all these priorities. Now to get to the answers to your questions, there is broad authority by the courts and the state under Article 10, Section 2. They can't, you always start with priorities in water, but in water conflicts you rarely end with them. Usually they're modified in some way, and we've seen that over the last 80 years under Article 10, Section 2. So I don't think it's time to abolish pre-14 rights. I think there's a huge challenge as to exactly what you would replace them with. Because certainty is important. It is large agricultural users who have pre-14 rights. But then again, we were talking about the Delta, and the California Department of Water Resources has water rights permits with a priority date, and that's what allows Metropolitan Water District and all that water move to urban Southern California. So if you're just going to completely throw open the priority system, it creates a situation where there's tremendous uncertainty, and I think it's very challenging to figure out how you reallocate it. Article 10, Section 2 does give a lot of authority to that. The only other thing I would say is that throughout this entire time, everything was focused on consumption and not on the environment very much at all. And when the water law system developed, there was a major court case in the early 1980s involving Mono Lake, which inserted the concept of the public trust doctrine into water law. And so that's very significant. The law adapted there. And then the Federal Endangered Species Act plays a huge role in California water law. So I would just close by saying I think that California's water law has proved to be very adaptive. We've gone from a mining state to an agricultural state to now a very urban state. There aren't many places that can say that. You know, the pure appropriation states in the western U.S. are still, by and large, mining states, and they do not have the agriculture. They don't have the dynamic urban economies we do. And so I think the system can continue to adapt. Obviously, it can still use some tweaking. But.
And do others have opposing views or slightly different views on that question? Jack?
I think I'd look to a solution. Boy, if we go and try and change the laws, there's going to be litigation for decades, which would be great for Eric.
There's litigation for decades anyway, however. So.
But there's, I think, managing our water better and more in a more sound policy would be the way to go. And what we've started to do now in the state are do water transfers, these agricultural to urban water transfers. So these pre-1914 rights, extremely valuable. Those districts have a lot of water. They are willing to sell that water to the urban suppliers when we need it and we're short. And that actually can help stabilize the agricultural economy when they go through their ups and downs. It's a tough business. A lot of the farmers now like these transfer programs because it ensures that they have more of a stable source of revenue, and that really helps them from a business perspective. So I think managing our water supply and putting it where it goes to the most economically valuable output is one solution that we can use and help manage our water better.
Okay, I'm going to step back from this and start to think about not just the practicality of undoing pre-1914 water rights, because everyone knows that would be a mess to do, but I actually want us to think about theoretically how would we want to allocate water in California? By what mechanism? And that's a really good question, because on the surface of it, there are some water rights out there that are being gamed and where I think you have some really irrational uses of water. And we may have some disagreements about this, but if you take the Palo Verde Irrigation District and the Imperial Irrigation District, they are taking their water from old water rights to the lower Colorado, and they are using about 10% of all the water that's being used in California and generating 0.2% of the state's gross domestic product. They're mostly growing alfalfa. They're growing water-thirsty crops. And you're like, well, why would you do that in 120-degree heat, especially in a drought? And the fact is, part of the reason that you're growing alfalfa is because the water essentially is free. They've got that water right. And then through, agricultural transfers, they're also making money. So they're either making money off free water or they're making money off free water. So you think well, that's crazy. We should change that. By decree, we should have some large authority that comes in and says, you can't do that anymore. And if you're going to grow something, it's got to be have greater value to the world's food shed, or it should evolve to the highest use. Maybe you could have a per capita, you could have like a per unit productivity standard for that. Even Teddy Roosevelt thought it was a good idea to divert water from the Owens Valley to Los Angeles. Conservationist that he supposedly was, he believed that the growth of Los Angeles was the better use, right? So you could say, well, yeah, we should divert the water to the highest possible use, but does that mean also urban sprawl? You have about 40% of this state's economy that's related directly or indirectly to new home building. So that's sprawl. So in some ways, if you worked by decree, you would have a tremendous amount of power being exerted by developers who are going to be building single family subdivisions well out into the desert with all of the environmental concerns that you have there. using, this complete supposed remaking of water rights. So there are big questions about whether actually you want control of basins that are kind of closer to a local level. Like in Southern California, you have a lot of lawsuits that were filed over groundwater basins, and you had adjudications who came out of that, and actually local water authorities who are called water masters, and those water masters will establish a maximum sustainable rate of pumping. So in places not like outside the Central Valley, you have examples of reasonably well-functioning groundwater management that's not coming from Sacramento, but actually from the a legacy settlement. So it seems on the surface that you could simply wave a magic wand and remake water rights in a much more rational way, but locating where that authority should exist is a more complicated issue than one might think.
The idea of well, Eric brought it up, of data. One of the problems with the current very complicated system of water use and water permits and water regulations, that complexity itself, if it's tweaked, is going to create all sorts of chaos, and I think that's what the previous speakers were alluding to. But from my perspective, one of the problems is the current system, even though it's somewhat stable and there's always local examples of good and wise water use, isn't enough. If you look at, for example, in terms of conservation, if we look at what vertebrate species are currently at most at risk, that are facing the fastest decline, that have more the bulk of all of these taxa are already on the threatened and endangered lists. Those are vertebrates that are associated with water. If you look at, for example, fish biodiversity, it's a very sad situation. There are constant additions to the list of threatened species in California. Amphibians, both in California, frogs and toads and cool things like that, are diminishing both in number and available habitat. Globally, amphibian species are declining and going extinct faster than any other group of vertebrates. Now, what I'm concerned with from my biased perspective here is how can water law, how can water use be actually used to promote and increase biodiversity? We're technically in probably the sixth great extinction on the history of the planet. Almost all of it from the effects of you and I, population pressures and pressures on resources. And in my opening remarks, I said one of the things that I found very, very difficult to even wrap my mind around was any solution to this crisis of loss of biodiversity because of water diversion and water use. There are some remedies, as Eric pointed out, that have popped up in the last maybe 40 years or so, but even those are reactive rules. So in terms of your question about repealing certain laws, et cetera, pre-1914, I have to judge all of those in what would be the most pragmatic approach to conserving biodiversity, especially in Southern California, and I hope we can get to that maybe.
So I'll move on to the second question and ask Jack to kick us off on this one. And perhaps it's no longer unprecedented, but when Governor Brown passed the mandate to increase conservation by 25% earlier this year, it's the first time something like that has happened in the state. And yet a recent, and I also believe most areas have actually met that, including Claremont. I think we're at, 40%, was it, conservation? Yet a recent LA Times article also highlighted the tension between water conservation and the need for water suppliers and or retailers to maintain operating costs. This is something we had talked about earlier this evening. So can you explain that tension or that puzzle for us? Is it or is it not an issue? And any elaboration on your part and everyone else's would be much appreciated.
Certainly, there is a big challenge for the water districts, especially at the retail level. Certainly, from a financial perspective, you have lower water sales, less revenue. Most water districts really have been billing based on the volume of water they sell. And you have large fixed costs. When you look at projects like we have with the State Water Project, the Colorado River Aqueduct, they're billions of dollars to build, hundreds of millions of dollars a year to operate. We spend $500 million a year on our State Water Project. That's the biggest single item in our budget. And when our sales go down, it's great. Everyone needs to conserve. It puts a financial burden on us. Fortunately, we've been in a good position where we've had reserve funds available to be able to handle those swings in sales. But many of the retail districts don't have that type of rate structure in place. And one of the things that I think could be changed, and you're seeing more of that now, are these tiered rate structures that these districts are putting in. And you might get a base amount allocated to the fixed costs. Every system has pumps, pipes, reservoirs, wells, and treatment plants that have to be paid for whether they produce water or not. And moving that water to your home has a certain cost to it. On a fixed basis, they've had to sell bonds and finance those facilities, and those costs don't go away. But what you can do is start putting rate structures in place that allocate water to you and as on a fixed basis, and they can be conserving rate structures as well. And the more water you use, you can get a base amount for your indoor use, for your outdoor use, and I think you see a lot of the articles in the LA Times about or Beverly Hills where they're using a lot of water, and Tom Selleck going out and getting water and from the fire hydrant, and these people that are using so much water and causing problems for everyone else. It is a challenge for the districts. I think the conserving rate structures are probably a way to go. There have been, and I think Eric can probably comment on it, some challenges in the law on how you can price water to promote conservation, and you can't. It is grounded in the cost of water, and you can't use your rate structures to be a punitive cost to someone. So we've got some policy issues that are a real challenge for the conservation of our supplies. That said, we do need to be able to conserve in the dry times. People have done a great job, gone way over and above what the governor has asked for. This hasn't happened too many times in our history. Back in the 90s, Metropolitan allocated water and asked for a 10% cutback. We're doing a 15% cutback at the wholesale level now under our water allocation plan. So about every 10 to 15 years, we get these drought cycles where we do need to allocate water. And we're trying to really instill an ethic of more efficient water use. And you'll see that with the turf removal programs that we have. District is spending nearly $500 million on conservation over the 2 years of this drought. And that's a huge cost to us, and that's going to create some challenges for us as well. I'll let some others comment now.
Well, I could comment. I'll comment on the legal issue at least. Certainly, water needs to cost more at some level. I think there are a few things that are universally agreed on in the water world, but that's one of them. Obviously, there needs to be some block of inexpensive, almost free water for people who have lower incomes. But when you start to move up the ladder and you're talking about using water outdoors, which is where most of our water use is, that needs to be more expensive. And also, we haven't really been paying for the upkeep of the infrastructure. Here in Claremont, a lot of the pipes in the ground are close to 100 years old, and that's true in a lot of older cities in Southern California. They, of course, break, lots of media coverage, there's flooding, they get fixed. That's something that needs to be going on a lot more than it is. But in California, because of the anti-tax fervor of prior decades and eras, There are various laws, including one called Proposition 218, which says that when you're a public agency and you charge for a fee for a service, that fee has to be directly related to the cost of the service. And that limits a public agency's ability to charge for the sorts of things Jack was just describing. And there was a court decision involving San Juan Capistrano just a couple of months ago that said in that situation, tiered pricing, which is the most effective way to get people to conserve, was invalid, at least as San Juan Capistrano had done it. Other agencies now are trying to learn from the mistakes they made and do it differently. The governor has listed among his goals for next year trying to change Prop 218, which I think would mean a ballot initiative. And the California Supreme Court has taken a case involving the city of Ventura, which could impact this. That decision might come down next year. But unfortunately, it's not at the moment, because of the recent court decision, just as simple as agencies deciding to do the block pricing and doing it. They have to be careful how they do it.
I just wanted to insert something in this. As somebody who thinks about water and its cost globally, I think it's actually remarkable in California that we have progressive pricing, whereby those who use a tremendous amount of water, those people with, fountains and topiaries and football field-sized lawns and all the fancy stuff, they're actually paying exponentially more for water than people who are maybe living without a blade of grass or living in a condominium or an apartment or paying rent. And I think that's great, because in most parts of the world, especially in arid areas, it's quite the opposite. And the poor are paying per unit far more than the rich for water. And oftentimes they're paying exorbitant amounts per gallon to have a water truck come and fill up oftentimes an old rusting barrel up in the hills, or having to pay for water to be piped up precarious hills and of very poor quality. So thinking about that, I think it's actually remarkable how well our urban water districts have done and the metropolitan water districts have done in making sure that water is pretty much available to urban ratepayers, even those of very limited income. There's another population in California we really should mention, who are people living in unincorporated communities who are oftentimes drawing on well water. And as you're having groundwater dropping, the quality of the water may be diminishing to absolutely undrinkable. So you have well over 200,000 people in California who are living in districts who do not have access to clean water and who are being advised by the counties, do not drink this water. So thinking about some of the water quality challenges that will also come along with drought and different kinds of flooding cycles. I think that some of the poorest people in this state, farm workers especially in unincorporated communities, are going to be facing enormous cost challenges, and I think we'll have to think about it as the state and think about that kind of real serious cost issue for people who can least afford to pay.
And maybe I have a follow-up for Anthony in relation to conservation. So how much of the conserved water might go for environmental flows, which is basically...
Well, that was the question I was going to ask, actually. So maybe Jack can put a little insight into when water amounts are actually measurably conserved, where does that water go?
That water right now is in storage. There's such low outflow from the delta today. Just to divert, we're only diverting about 300 cubic feet per second out of the delta, or 600 acre feet per day. That's about enough for 1,200 homes for a year. That's being diverted every day right now. So the flows are so low, and our runoff is so low. That water that's conserved has come out of storage. We've taken our storage reserves down significantly during this drought, so it's not being made available for wildlife. It's just not there right now.
And then the other, is agriculture. And one of the concerns I think that all of us have is if we're talking about just the net use of water, what proportion of water in the state of California is used for agriculture, and what portion of the agricultural users are actually maybe pre-1914, are also paying extraordinarily low rates for consumption, and have very little conservation, or let me put it this way, very little motivation to conserve, because the governor hasn't really put forward anything, as far as I can tell, in agriculture. And the reason I'm asking this is there is sort of a zero-sum game with water, and those of you that might know the figures might want to mention to the audience how much water in California goes to agriculture and what kind of conservation measures there are there.
You want to take it and I'll follow. Go ahead.
Now, from the state water system, if you look at water that goes through the delta, about a third of it is used upstream from the delta. About half goes out to the ocean or for environmental uses. On the Colorado River, California gets 4.4 million acre-feet of water per year. 3.85 of that goes to the agricultural districts along the river, Palo Verde Irrigation District and the Imperial Irrigation District, and they're farming year-round. Now, we've been able to partner with some of those farms, and we have fallowing programs now in place where we will have them during drought periods fallow their fields and pay them for their water. That's one of the things that we've done. And so Metropolitan's base entitlement to Colorado River water is 550,000 acre-feet of water. Our aqueduct capacity is about 1.2 million acre-feet, or double that, and we've been able to pretty much fill that gap with the programs that we've done with water transfers and fallowing programs. So there is some ag to urban transfer, but primarily most of the Colorado River water is used along the agricultural districts there.
The number you frequently hear, is 80% of the water used in California is for agriculture. That's 80% of the consumed water. If you look at total water use, it's really 20% urban, 40% ag, 40% the environment. But certainly in terms of water people use, the vast majority is agriculture. The governor did not specifically target agriculture. He asked for urban conservation. In agriculture at this point, I think it's fair to say that conservation follows the money. If you're growing a high-margin crop, if you're growing grapes, which go into wine, which people pay lots of money per bottle for, you're probably using drip irrigation. If you're farming up in the Salinas Valley, you're growing artichokes, again, really high-value crops, you're using very efficient irrigation. If you're down in the Imperial Valley, like Heather was just talking about, growing alfalfa, which is a low-margin crop, and you have a very old water right, you're probably using flood irrigation.
And I think one of the main points here is the conservation is, it looks like it's, even with the ag, the transfers, it goes from ag to urban, not ag to environment, right? Just want to clarify that. All right, so I think we'll go to probably the last question. I'm going to skip one because of time, and we want Q&A. So question first for the audience. How many here, just show of hands, have heard of the Bay Delta Conservation Plan, or the BDCP? Not bad. All right. Okay. So progress. So often, folks in Southern California have not heard of it. I think it's more and more in the news. Certainly, if I asked this question up in Berkeley, I would think everyone would raise their hands. It's a north versus south issue. And I'd like to ask the panelists, again, probably in a nutshell, to explain what the BDCP is, if you'd like to. And I'll ask Anthony to take the question first. But basically, in terms of as a conservation plan, and one of the most controversial elements is just two massive tunnels being tunneled under the delta. We've mentioned delta 3 times. So under the delta to bring water from the north down to the south, right? Also serving the Central Valley. But as Heather already mentioned, the delta is already very fraught ecologically, in terms of the levees, in terms of both flood and earthquake. So it's already screwed. This is one potential way of dealing with that, and different stakeholders have very different takes on it. I know Met has been very supportive of it. Governor Brown and the DWR, which is the Department of Water Resources, has been behind it. But it's in no way a done deal, and there's a lot of opposition. So Anthony, as a biologist, what is your take on the Bdcp? And then we'll open it up to the others.
I'll make mine brief. As a biologist, I think there's a lot more risk than benefit. The primary arguments, I think, the environmental uses and the restoration of the bay are argued as if to overcome an obstacle to deliver the water to the south. I really have read enough comment letters from some very reputable people to make me think that ecological restoration is not, one, on the top agenda of this project, and two, there's a lot of, I think, wishful thinking. There is a lot of money that's going to be put into mitigation and restoration, and in that there is some value. But the project, as a method to deal with problems of the bay and also other wetlands problems in the Central Valley, it's really not a good idea for that. Then there's a suite of other issues: climate change, the length of time to build a project, what California and the world will be like when this project is actually done, the ultimate sources of water, how much really will make it to Southern California is, I don't know. I've heard various things. So I guess I'll pass it on to there. But if you're looking, but if you're looking at it as a way to improve the ecological health of the Delta and the Bay and Central California, I think there's a lot of cheaper and more effective ways to work. But it's a very complicated problem.
Well, I don't disagree with parts of that, I guess, except your ultimate conclusion. Is this a good way to design a water system? No. Bringing the water through the delta is not the ideal by a long shot. But the key thing about the Bdcp is it's not to expand the amount of water that comes to Southern California. This is not increasing the amount of water. This is to really maintain the supply. And so you have a situation where 20 million people really in Southern California, in parts of the Central Valley and in the Bay Area depend on water that's moved through the Bay Delta. Like it or not, that's the way it is, and that area is growing. And that population is growing and going to grow. It's actually difficult to think of another developed area in the world that depends on such a fragile water supply. I was just sitting here thinking about that. I cannot think of one off the top of my head. And so we have to make the best of a bad situation. I think there is a lot of money for the environmental mitigation. It's not ideal, but even with recycling, which we need to do a lot more of, even with more turf removal and more conservation and more stormwater recapture, which is a lot we need to do on as well, it's still an imported water source is necessary for Southern California to continue the function in the vibrant economy as it is. So I think I come down in favor of the Bdcp. It's a challenging project. I'll leave that to the engineers. In terms of the feasibility, I guess it is feasible, but in terms of the options available, I think it is one we have to take.
I'm going to say that if I could get in a time machine and go back 200 years, there are two things in the West I would like to see. I would like to see the Colorado flowing to the sea and to see that delta flooding in the springtime, and to understand what it would look like to see a Massachusetts-sized area flooded with waters and tributaries and deer and masses of birds, and to understand how that actually functioned. Now, the Colorado River doesn't even reach the sea. It's a dry desert. It's a saline area with mostly creosote bushes. And to think about what was lost there, and then also to think about the majesty of the inland delta of California in its early state. This is like the American Okavango. It's a really rare delta because the delta spills down from the Sierras and then it spreads out over the plains. And so it's unlike a lot of deltas that spread out and into the sea, but it's actually a reverse triangle. And for that reason, ecologically, it had in some wet years, you had an inland sea there with migratory birds, 90% of whom are now all gone, and they have to mostly rely on the Salton Sea, which is a really troubled water body, as many of you may know. So thinking about what we've lost there, and thinking about what can be salvaged in the Delta is a really important moral question for us as Californians. And as you pointed out, we've identified as co-equal goals the idea of preservation of the environment and serving human needs. But so when we think about the Bay Delta Conservation Project, the Bdcp as it's called, there are two parts of it, one of which is conserving water supply from the Delta to parts south. And that's to be achieved with big tunnels that are going to cost at least $11 billion. Now, that part we know how to fund. That'll be ratepayers who pay that in the south. The other part, which can be, some people are naming sums that should fund it of $20 billion or more. No one knows where that's going to come from, and presumably that's going to come from taxpayers. And that's why Jerry Brown keeps kind of downscaling what in fact will be done in terms of like conservation and restoration of the Delta. So it's important for us to think about when we talk about the Bdcp, what's paid for, or what we know will be paid for by ratepayers, and the other part which could just be wishful thinking and could be passed down to next generations while species like the Delta smelt and like the endangered salmon and bird species are suffering, right? So we have big questions about that. And the other question is, do we know enough science? I mean, is there enough science about the Delta? We have no baseline point. We don't really know how the Delta functioned prior to human engineering. Do we actually know how to do the mitigation, the remediation of wetlands and the marshes, and in a really complex and unique ecosystem? So I can, again, thinking about the politics of this is going to take a generation or more to sort out and to come up with a plan that may or may not work as far as the kinds of conservation of ecosystems that we'd like.
So is that a yes or no in favor of or against? Or you're not undecided?
I think we're looking at one of the, just a huge hanging liability with the system of levees that we've got right now. Some of them are over 100 years old. You have a lot of the land that's subsiding. So you have rivers that are up to, 10, 12 meters above the surrounding area. If any of those dikes is breached, the cost in human lives is going to be enormous. People, even if we were able to evacuate people before a troubled levee went, the cost in terms of people's livelihoods and whole areas is going to be huge. So I'm worried about that. So if we don't build these tunnels, I think that we've got to make a plan for Southern California to work with Northern California in reinforcing those levees in a way that will address both the subsidence problems. I don't know if that can be done in engineering terms, as well as just this ongoing problem of holding back ever more pressure from those rivers as they as the land around them drops from subsidence and groundwater loss, and also just like basic natural processes of rebuilding the land there that existed when all that carbon matter would be deposited every year with floods that doesn't get there anymore. So all of that just gets more and more compressed over time. So this is just a problem of engineering rivers, and we find it in China with the Yellow River. We find it here in California with the hanging rivers problem. I don't know if there's a technical fix for that, and if there isn't, then probably you got to build the tunnels. But that's also, when you start to think about it, it's a legal and environmental challenge, shall we say.
And final word on this, thanks. Jack?
I don't know if everyone knows the history. The BDC is looked at as a new program. It actually started in the 1960s with the design of the State Water Project, and there wasn't enough money at the time to build the project as it was envisioned. And the original project actually would have built the diversions where they're being proposed today. And back in the 60s, they realized that where the facilities are today was not the ideal place for them. And they knew there would be fishery impacts, water quality impacts. So you saw it in the 80s with the peripheral canal. That was the next iteration of it. Now we have the Bdcp, Bay Delta Conservation Program, and the twin tunnels. It really is a challenge with both sides of the house. The water users will pay for the tunnels, the beneficiary pays concept for those. We're really looking in our planning for the future, the next 20 years, of just maintaining our supply from the Delta. But all the new growth that comes into Southern California, we're looking to handle through conservation, local supply development with recycled water. San Diego has a seawater desalination plant that's going to be coming online later this year that's going to provide water in San Diego County, looking at stormwater capture and other local supplies to meet the needs of our growing population. People still like to come and live in California. It's a great place to be. The weather's nice, lots of fun things to do. You got the beach, the mountains, and everything. The lifestyle here still attracts a lot of people, and we're trying to provide that and make sure that the people that are here do use the water efficiently and effectively and for the best use. So we are evaluating the Bdcp. We don't know where the final costs are going to come in. That's a very big part of our evaluation. Not all the water agencies agree that they want to pay for it at this point. So there's a lot of negotiation that still has to go on and see who's going to participate. And we're hopeful that that's going to go forward. We think it will, and that we'll reach an agreement. But certainly the funding of the mitigation that's funded by others is going to be a big challenge too. And at least one of the things that's moving forward there is an adaptive management plan. So if we're trying things and they're not working, they can go to something else that will hopefully get the benefits for the ecosystem that we need to provide.
Thank you so much. So we're at 8, and I promised to stay on time. And we have 15 minutes for audience Q&A. So do we have mics that are roaming? Okay. So there's.
I have a reasonable use doctrine question. If one entity buys out a water system, do the water rights that are associated with that system automatically transfer? And of course, I'm thinking of Claremont and the Golden State water system.
First of all, in terms of full disclosure, I'm with Best and Krieger, and Best and Krieger represents Claremont in that litigation. Actually, I don't think it's a reasonable use question exactly, I would say. I can tell you what my view of it is, and also, of course, happens to be the client's view, is that when you have a monopoly, like a regulated public utility does, as Golden State does to serve, part of the quid pro quo for that monopoly is that the water rights they have are dedicated to serve the city. And so the water does go, would have to go. I mean, if the city acquires that, Golden State does not get to keep the water. I actually don't think even Golden State contends that, but Golden State contends that the water rights should be valued separately from the system. I don't think that makes sense given the water rights go with it, but obviously Golden State's attorneys have a different view, and as with many things on water, a judge will decide it one of these days, I guess.
I just want to thank our panel for speaking with us tonight. Whoa, this is crazy. In terms of water, can I just yell? No. In terms of water conservation, how much is coming from big industries? I'm thinking of energy production, fracking in California, other manufacturing processes. I feel like that's been left out of the conversation tonight. A lot of pressure is put on municipalities and houses and consumers. Can one of you speak to that?
There are programs for both residential and commercial and industrial users. We have a lot of incentives. For example, the oil refineries along the coast, cooling towers, restaurants. We go into a lot of those industries, evaluate the water use in their processes that they use, and suggest ways then that they can save water. We offer rebates for them. I don't have a quantity that I could give you off the top of my head, but we do go in with these businesses and evaluate them and look at how they can improve their water use. I know we've gone into bottling plants and all types of industries. So there are programs available for them, and many of the commercial operations in their processes, we do that as well.
And what about produced water with fracking?
We don't, well, in our area, we don't have that, so I'm not equipped to speak to that.
I mean, my guess would be otherwise the fracking that's going on in non-municipal areas, so they're pumping, I think, largely groundwater for that, and the governor's orders have not covered groundwater pumping by non-urban agencies.
I have one statistic from the UCLA Institute for Environment and Sustainability on this, and it actually indicates that industrial uses are about 1% of uses, and that commercial urban is about 4% of use. So there are reasons to be concerned about where fracking is occurring and what that might mean for let's say contamination of groundwater supplies. So for example, you have some energy production that's being done in Los Angeles County and Orange County that I'm somewhat concerned about, because we have this remarkable system of basin storage here. So we have a conjunctive use of water. So we not only are using this groundwater and managing it pretty well, but we also, when we import water from the Colorado River, or we're importing water from the State Water Project, oftentimes we're percolating that into these groundwater basins. And these are sedimentary formations, and so you have a lot of mobility of water through them. It makes for a marvelous distribution system for water, but you also don't want to have a distribution system for fracking chemicals or for other kinds of chemicals that could be used in energy production. So we already have some very, very expensive toxic plumes that we're dealing with in highly urbanized areas that also have legacy dump sites, perchlorate, TCE, some other things, and you've had chromium-6 that ratepayers and others have been left to clean up in future generations. So I think this is a really good question, not just in terms of quantity of water, but also thinking about quality of water and who's left with the cleanup bill if there's contamination of our water supplies in those basins.
Yes, we have heard a lot about the Bay Delta. I was wondering if anybody could address the Colorado River Pact and how the current and or future negotiations of those allocations would affect California.
There is the agreement that there's been a quantification settlement agreement in about 2006, I believe. The water rights have. We have contracts with the federal government long term, so our rights are fairly well set in a priority system among the 7 states that share water in the Colorado River. There's an upper basin and a lower basin. We are in the lower basin with Nevada and Arizona, and I think you've probably all seen the stories about the Colorado River storage and Lake Mead moving down and the shortages that potentially could be coming. There are provisions in those agreements that Arizona and Nevada take the first shortages, and California does not until we get to very low water levels. And then it will become a negotiation with the Secretary of the Interior on who is the water master for the Colorado River, on how those shortages would be shared. So for the foreseeable future, it looks like we have a pretty set supply for California. We'll see what the drought looks like. There's been about a 15-year drought on the Colorado River where we've had a couple of good years, but those agreements were set in place initially during a wet hydrology period, and the flow in the river was fairly high, and that's where the apportionments were based off of. So you've seen now the levels coming down. The storage with Lake Mead and Lake Powell has really saved us on the river. There's 60 million acre feet of storage. It's the most storage of any project in the country. So that's been a big buffer for us. Certainly had a lot of impacts to the river system, changing the flows that much. But for the foreseeable future, we look with the fallowing programs, conservation programs, and things that we're doing on the river, we think our water supply is fairly certain.
And just to add to that, I think, and the media loves water wars. They love to report on that. But there really is a lot more cooperation than litigation in water. And I think what's gone on in the Colorado in the last 10 years has been an underreported success story where the lower basin states, and there is no end to the paranoia in Arizona about California's, ideas for the Colorado River. But Arizona, Nevada, California, and other, basin states have worked together in terms of storing water for each other and banking water, and really created a lot more flexibility working with the Secretary of the Interior than existed under the original compact. So.
Hi. So I had a question. Most of what's been discussed tonight has kind of been based on shorter-term solutions, and that they're all kind of grounded in that we have huge reserves in all of our reservoirs. And so I'm wondering, also I feel like this wouldn't be complete without some climate change question. So in the future, so longer-term planning, what's being discussed in the face of climate change, which predicts not only more frequent and more severe and longer droughts, but also in warmer temperatures that would severely impact our snowpack, which, for those who don't know, is a huge water reserve.
That's being addressed in both the Colorado River system. The Department of Interior Bureau of Reclamation has recently gone through studies on the Colorado River. We're looking out 50 years and evaluating the climate change impacts and what that might mean for water demands and water supply. When you go out in the long term towards 2060 in that area, looks like we will be short. Our demands will outstrip our supply. So the planners are working to come up with ideas on how to remedy that. Fortunately, it's not happening immediately, but we do need to make some long-term adjustments there. The same thing on the state side. Department of Water Resources at the state is factoring in climate change and what that might mean. There could be sea level rise that impacts the salinity in the water supply. Certainly all the things that have been mentioned with earthquake risk and other factors in water quality. And the snowpack that you mentioned, that's being factored in. There are proposals you'll see for additional off-stream reservoirs that would be able to take more of the runoff in the form of precipitation. Yes, the snowpack, we do get about a third of our supply from that, so it's a huge source. You're seeing the projections for temperature going up and less snowpack. We've been setting a lot of records this last couple of years, hottest temperatures in the state, lowest snowpack on record. So the system is changing, and we'll have to look at developing plans to adapt to that. And it's underway, but there's not a comprehensive plan for it today.
Oh, I just wanted to say one thing. I think your question also points to something that we were talking about earlier, which is this really big tension between flood control and planning for water storage, because not only are we talking about changing patterns of precipitation in terms of like what form it falls in, but you also may have more intense precipitation events. So that means, especially with these steep California mountains, both here in Southern California as well as in Northern California, the possibility for devastating floods in storm events. And so the easiest way to get water away from people are concrete channels. But that's one of the worst things that you can do for wildlife, for ecosystems, and ultimately for water storage, right? You want to have the water spread out over a nice spreading ground and then refill your groundwater basins, which is the best way to store it and also the way to deal with subsidence. But yeah, I think that I'm going to more and more meetings where in the Southland where I'm having people say, you know what, El Nino, the big one is coming, and this could overwhelm flood structures. We need so much more cement. And I'm thinking, wow, this is a real dilemma. Do you plan for lots more water storage with slow percolation, or do you just say shoot it out to the ocean? Can you do both? And so I hope with all the engineers in the room here that you can actually help us think about how we can work with natural systems to preserve ecosystems and also have them work in our favor, and then also potential urban planners in here who can help us think about planning around riparian areas, which are not only good for wildlife but also a really important part of dealing naturally with floods and for also storing that water in a natural way where it reaches our aquifers again. So there's a lot to be done.
I have a little bit more confidence in how we deal as a society with the changes you just described. Much more confident that we can deal with water supply. I'm less confident about natural systems responding in that same time period. I think we can acclimatize and come up with some engineering solutions, but we're already seeing the consequences in our local habitats just from the increased frequencies of hot fires and hard rains. One of the reasons I got interested in fish genetics, by the way, which is something I never thought I would be interested in, was a conversation a few years ago with some Forest Service people, and there's a small species of fish called Santa Ana speckled bass, which inhabits the tributaries from the San Gabriel watershed across the Santa Ana watershed. And those fish now only live basically where national forest kind of starts because they've been extirpated from the hustle and bustle of us and flood control. But recently in the 2003-2004 rains, there was some really hard fires in the fall in 2003, and then in 2004 there was one of these incredible unprecedented rains. And that fish, Santa Ana speckled bass, was extirpated and locally extinct in 2 of the 5 streams in which it resides in the Santa Ana watershed. And we went back and looked at records, and those fish were present, as best as we could tell, for well over 100 years without interruption. And just one season of hot fire and gnarly rain drove 2 of the 5 populations to extinction. And I'm thinking that I don't know if there's an engineering solution to that. I mean, God bless the engineers, but we really need to have a much more holistic approach to water as an essential part of biodiversity and ecosystems, as well as a commodity that we all use and enjoy. But I have no answer. I don't think anybody here does.
So I think that'll wrap up the formal portion. And let me just out my individuals. This here is the birdwatcher, avid ornithologist. We've got the xeriscaper, all decomposed granite, Kansas City Royals fan, and the Harley Davidson on a date night. Thank you all.
I'd like to thank our panelists again for joining us tonight, and thank you all for attending. I hope you'll join us on November 19 for our next lecture in the series, which discusses vanishing beaches caused by oceanfront development and sea level rise. To conclude our evening, please enjoy the art installation and dessert reception in the Sprague Courtyard immediately outside the auditorium. Good night.